We have now released issue 3 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine. Download it for free at newthinkingaloud.org. New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the life and work of the 14th century Persian mystic Hafiz. My guest is Gach, the author of The Complete Idiot's Guide to Buddhism, as well as Pause, Breathe, Smile, Awakening Mindfulness When Meditation is Not Enough. Gary has co-translated 3 books of poetry from Korean by Goethe, Flowers of a Moment, 10,000 Lives, and Songs for Tomorrow. His anthology, What Book? Buddha Poems from Beat to Hiphop, received an American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation. He is an adjunct faculty member at the University of San Francisco and has recently released Hafiz's Little Book of Life, which he co-translated with Irfan Mujib. Gary is based in San Francisco, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Gary. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's my pleasure as well.
You are a translator of Korean poetry and of Persian poetry, and I think in both cases it's fair to say you worked with native speakers of each of those languages to do the translations. I gather, Gary, primarily you're a poet yourself, so you bring to the task a poetic sensibility.
That's right. I also have translated all the dynasties of Chinese poetry with a native speaker who really initiated me into the fact that I have this gift. There's many things I've tried in life, from longshoreman to administrator in a hospital and so forth, but this is one thing I know how to do.
When we talk about Hafiz, a 14th century Persian mystic, the fundamental ground rule for translators and researchers into Hafiz has been, to my understanding, that it's not translatable, that if you're not a citizen of 14th century Persia, it's very hard to have a clue as to what he's talking about.
Well, that's right. It's also true for other people, human beings of that order of magnitude, like Akhmatova, Blake, Basho, Cervantes, Dufour, Dante, Goethe, Homer, Sappho. You know, they're so rooted in their cultural soil and universal that it's hard to bring you need to bring the roots and everything that the roots are holding. So you just can't repot it exactly. And of all of these, I think Persians are the most guarded about Hafiz because on the one hand, they think that, he's like their prize possession. And on the other hand, they're his prize possession.
Well, there are a lot of paradoxes associated with Hafiz, one of which is, from my understanding, is that he is considered antinomian. He rebels against the establishment, and yet he was supported by the establishment in his day.
The word R-E-N-D or R-E-N-D-I in Persian is very hard to translate. Antinomian, you could say free spirit. you could say, trickster. And yes, he was embedded in the court for much of his life as a livelihood. And yet he also was not hesitant to speak truth to power, to, for example, call out the hypocrisy of priests who say one thing but do another. And that spirit is so that, you may find universal analogies or analogs, but it's so rooted in Persian culture. And it's a key one. You've really nailed that in your discernment.
Well, in your book, especially in the early section when you describe his biography, you point out that during his lifetime there were, I think, 8 different rulers of Persia, and they were all very different. Some of them were quite liberal, some of them were extremely autocratic, and at the end, Persia was conquered by Tamerlane, who was regarded historically as one of the most vicious characters in all of history. And apparently, Hafiz had a pretty good relationship with this man.
Yeah, exactly. In a nutshell, he was not unused to perilous times. And none of the rulers under whom he lived came to a good end. They all had violent ends. And during those rules in his lifetime, the Mongols were picking away at various parts of the world, including Persia, which had been a great empire. And the Mongols were building a bigger empire. And so he was living in this time of, a radical shift in, certainly in geopolitics and all that would bring with it. He was rooted in Shiraz the whole time. And I'll point out that in his day, Shiraz was like Florence under the de Medicis. It's like the Athens of Persia. So he had a terrific seat in the house for the whole shebang. And at some point, he had to go underground. He had, said the wrong thing to his patron about poetry. He said, your poet, he dissed his patron's poetry, which is like, oh. And he had to, but then there was this one ruler who came in who was a fundamentalist of the worst order. He was brutal, vicious, closed everything down. And so during that period, Hafiz, in isolation, continued to write, and he was inclusive. So he included the politics. If I can just make one more beat and speak in a 34-beat sentence for this, I think it's really interesting to me, and it may just be me, that in his embrace of the divine and the mundane as one, right, which is typically like the Song of Songs or the Bride of Christ, where the divine is a person and it's also the beloved unnameable, fused, mirroring and magnifying each other. He also includes, as I hear it, the soul of the world. And that would include the ruler, but also just the state of the world as being like the anima of the times. So for him, I hear all three as being bound together.
And I gather amongst the Persian people, poetry is considered a high art form. The fact that the ruler, even a despot, would be practicing poetry suggests that they regarded poetry maybe the way we moderns regard popular music. It's something that everybody participates in one way or another.
Well, it's a very important point. And on the way over here, I thought of a way of explaining If I go to a bookstore and I want to get the Dhammapada, which is pretty accurately words of the Buddha as spoken, it's a book of poetry. If I go to the bookstore and I get Old Lao's Book of Tao, in any of the translations, it's a book of poetry. Do they shelve it in poetry? No, they shelve it in religion, Eastern philosophy, spirituality. We separate the two in our culture. Americans are pragmatic. They're about stuff. They're not, they're not typically about the spirit except the other world and the hereafter. Until we had Rumi as the most popular poet in America for 10 years. And Omar Khayyam in his day was the most popular poet of the century. But in the West, we separate them. And in the East, in China also, for example, the poets were court members, and the language of poetry was a court language as well as a language of Confucianism or Taoism or Buddhism. So, our lens is like we're looking at the wrong end of the telescope, really. And in Persia, because they're not separating into two separate things, philosophy, spirituality, and poetry, in our reception of Persian spirituality, we typically come at it through poetry first. Omar Khayyam, Attar, Rumi, Hafiz, before we might go on to read strictly Sufi philosopher writers who wrote in prose.
I gather Hafiz was a Sufi himself. The Sufis were mystics. And I think the history of Sufism in Persia and elsewhere is kind of a mixed history. Many of the great Sufis were executed by the religious authorities, so it was kind of a mixed bag. Being a Sufi was a little dangerous.
Good point. That's right. I locate in a just general sense that Sufism shares a commonality with Taoism as against Confucianism, Zen as against traditional Buddhism, Hasidism as against Judaism as a religion, the Christian mystics, the Desert Fathers, all share a kind of an underground commonality with different points of departure and different means. But certainly they get in trouble. And of all of them, the Sufis have had the worst run-ins when, for example, someone is trying to speak in a poem about feeling union with the divine, and they say, no, that's heresy. You can't say that you are God. But did the person say that? If you read the poem, they were very tactful and precise as to the subtle difference of where the point of view is in the author, on whose authority is this being written. But Sufism. And just to dot an I in Sufism, if I may, Hafiz was never known to be a member of any Sufi order. We're not sure if he had a peer, a leader, although it's possible, for example, that he studied with a group that was called the Philosophy of Love. But we don't know. There's so much about his life that's unknown. It's as if he burned himself up as he went along to leave no trace but these poems. And in the poems, we also hear Zoroastrianism. And because Hafiz means to be able to recite, and he could recite the Quran by memory, he quotes Jesus, Noah, Joseph in the desert a lot. So in his inclusivity, he's very embracing of a number of different, what you might call denominations, faiths, schools.
Well, I'm under the impression today, for example, we live in a very multicultural society. So I know you, for example, have been exposed to Hasidism and Zen and many different spiritual traditions, as have I, as have many of our viewers. It's a sort of a spiritual supermarket out there. And what I hear from people who are engaged in various mystical paths is that they have more in common with each other than they have with the fundamentalists of their own faith.
That's right. However, I personally have a feeling that if I got there on the back of a camel or a donkey, and somebody else got there from the pointy end of a jet, yeah, we all arrive at the same place. But personally, I think it counts as to the journey and the points of departure and the journey. So I look at both. And I could give you an obvious example, and that's Sufism. I'm not raised Sufi. I'm not raised Arabic, but I'm raised Jewish. And being raised Jewish, when I was exposed to a lineage of 15 generations of Hasidism, man, I got it. You know, it's hard not to get Hasidism when you're in that connection with the presence of that tradition. And then when I was in the tradition, when I was exposed to the tradition of Buddhism, especially through the Vietnamese teacher, may his memory be a blessing, Thich Nhat Hanh, I felt the presence. It was like it wasn't about the ink of my intellect. It was the presence. And these traditions all say you have to abandon your intellectual, filters in order to connect with something beyond words. But during my course of studies of Buddhism, initially, I was comparing it to what I knew. Oh, this is like what I've experienced in Hasidism. Until I was able to say, no, let me see it in and of itself. And now I'm at a point in Sufism where I've, what am I, a Jufi, right? I need to really connect more with Sufi teachers, because we have all these things available to us, as you say, like the spiritual supermarket. But I think at the next phase is grounding in a personal practice that's connected with a community who has a strong teacher. And that's true for all of the ones you've mentioned. And I think many people, yourselves, guests on the show, listeners, have experienced this rather than, going and picking and choosing things out of books and kind of making what feels right for themselves, which can work to a certain degree as a gateway. But then, the caravan moves on.
Well, speaking for myself, I, like you, raised Jewish, but I'm a secular person, and I'm not become a Buddhist or a Sufi or a Chassid or any of those. I admire them all, but I suppose I keep them at a distance. I, ended up studying parapsychology. That's maybe my path in life. It's hardly a spiritual path. But with regard to Hafiz, you're suggesting he may have been a secular person himself in this regard, although in 14th century Persia you couldn't exactly be secular.
There, we've isolated your Hafiz. Great, and I think that's what Hafiz is and does. It's very much how we experience the kind of cyclotron of ideas and images and experiences that he puts us through to come to our own soul connection. And just to cross a T in connection, parapsychology is spiritual. It's not about matter. Scientists study the relation of matter. Western scientists study the relation of matter to matter. Then if you study the relation of matter to non-local phenomena, that gets more into a non-material. And if it's non-material, it's spiritual. It still can be secular. And if it's non-local to non-local, then it's certainly not material, except to the degree that we both have bodies to so forth. And I locate the art of spirituality of Jeffrey Mishlove exactly as you say, as someone who has delved more deeply than anybody I know in terms of connections to different sources and finding a base of your own, which happens to be something that we still call, what are we going to call it in 20 years from now? Maybe we'll have a better name for it. We might call it interconnection.
Interconnection is a great name. I like it.
All right.
Let's talk about poetry in and of itself for a moment. I know you've written, for example, about the beat poets, and there's a sense to me that the beat poets are a bit like Hafiz in that they had spiritual interests, and they also were wildly engaged in life itself, breaking every rule, taking every drug, drinking every drink, engaging in a wide variety of sensual pleasures, but still dealing with the core of what would I call it? Almost the agony sometimes of the human experience. Many of the beat poets came to sad endings, as did many great Sufis. How would you compare the beats with a poet like Hafiz?
I've never thought of that before until now. What a marvelous association. Yeah. Many of the beats, like not many, but I think of, for example, Allen Ginsberg, he came from a place of privilege, and yet he crossed the line of his comfort zone in social standing and was familiar with what Hafiz calls the dregs drinkers, the people who will close the bar at 2 a.m. or whenever the bars close. And he likewise inherited a prophetic tradition that not only comes from his Jewish roots, but also he identified with Whitman and Blake and other prophetic poets. And the whole idea of the beats as a name came from beatitude. This was at the time of the possibility of the bomb wiping everything out after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's a moment in time that you could certainly make a lot of connections between Kerouac, Bob Kaufman, Joanne Kiger, Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder, Philip Whalen, Lou Welch, to poetry, except that Hafiz was known throughout Persia and the Persian-speaking world in his lifetime, whereas the beats, if you went to a bar, you could fit all of them in the back at around 1 or 2 tables. So there's that difference. So compare, contrast.
To my knowledge, Allen Ginsberg had worldwide fame. And in fact, my stepson met him in China.
Oh, that's true. Yes. No, Allen, of all of them, was like the traveling publicist. Allen was the internet of the day. He was plugged into everybody and everything. But Bob Kaufman? No. Kerouac? Maybe, but not exactly in his lifetime. The difference I guess I should bring out is that Hafez was sung, and that was a medium that included what we now call the troubadours, the trouvères of the 14th century in Europe, which then influences Dante. And the lyrics would travel all over the world and would be instantly sung. The stuff I remember in the era of beatniks were mimeos and xeroxes. And yes, it opened a door to spoken arts. The first reading of the Sixth Gallery sort of inaugurated spoken arts in America for poetry. Gosh, you've got me going. I could do the whole thinking aloud about this.
That's great, Gary. And I'm wondering about the role of the poet in society. I interviewed one poet many years ago, David White, and he seemed to say that the role of the poet was to enable people to get in touch with something deeper and truer within themselves, ultimately calling people, I don't know, you might say to a mystical place, but I'm not sure he would use that word, maybe a more authentic place within themselves.
And doesn't David White inherit the Irish bardic tradition now? So yeah, he's another of these voices that are speaking, rooted in a cultural soil in which poetry is more than just something you see on the internet with a nice picture. It's something that you not just read aloud. When you hear David White read, he'll read a line, then he'll read it over in the next line. He's creating the poem as he reads it. And his sense of a social conscience was there from the beginning of his writing. And a very unique figure at that. Whereas Mary Oliver, who I'd position as a pioneer in our time of spiritual, devotional poetry, not necessarily religious or anything like that, but intimate with the source of life and one's own connection, without ever bringing up the state of the world, as David White so often poetically does. So yeah, I think, it's up to each person and each poet to find where they want to position themselves in this vast banquet called life.
I gather people regard Hafez as being in the tradition of Rumi, who I believe was about 100 years earlier. And Rumi is regarded, he founded a Sufi order, was regarded as a person close to God, close to an expression of pure love, as the Sufis think of love, divine love. That this is also part of why Hafez is regarded so highly some 700 years after his death.
Well, I'll see you and I'll raise you one. My friends in Iran are really kind of like, what's up with these Americans trying to discover, are they Hafez? Because to them, they're aware of the Rumi phenomenon. They're aware that Attar's Conference of the Birds has been translated. Some know that, Omar Khayyam was very popular. But to them, in Iran, it's like this, and Hafez is off the charts. He's not in this. Some people, and there are people in Iran who disagree. They say, no, Rumi. It's like, is it Anna Karenina or is it War and Peace? But it's more. In Iran, Hafez is not only considered the poet philosopher, he's considered an avatar who is an oracle. And you go to any home with a bookshelf, you'll find a Quran, and you'll find a copy of his poetry, well thumbed through, well worn, memorized. Everybody knows him by heart. They may not be this, they'll know lines of Rumi. They'll know lines of Attar, Sadi, Khayyam. But Hafez they know by heart. He is, if Rumi, I'm going to riff on Omid Safi saying, Rumi is like a deep ocean of wisdom, and Hafez is like a brilliant jewel. Okay, I'll keep the ocean metaphor. Rumi is a deep ocean of wisdom, and Hafez is like Shakespeare, about whom Keats asked, which play you like depends on how you like the ocean best. As a storm, as rain, as, this or that. He encompasses, he's so inclusive and equanimous in his reach, not only in subject matter, not only in his grasp of Persian culture, but in his innovations in Persian a style of singing and writing. So, I'm agreeing, and I'm just kind of raising that up to a few more orders of magnitude.
Well, I do know that many great writers in the Western tradition, writers like Goethe and Nietzsche, regarded Hafez as being the literary equivalent of Shakespeare. But as I think about it, Shakespeare, universally regarded maybe as the greatest writer in any language, was largely secular. I would say entirely secular. I see almost no traces of mysticism in Shakespeare, but in Hafez, one finds exactly that.
Well, it's true that in Hafez we can get a pretty good read of the various secular, non-secular views of the time, without him ever having taken any of the vows. Shakespeare seemingly might have been influenced by Giordano Bruno, right? Who is a character Brown in one of his plays, in a time in the Renaissance when new spiritual perspectives were opening up. Also, I've looked at Shakespeare in terms of alchemy, and I see evidence that the plays are performative alchemical rites with the different elements and planets coming into various relations and resolving and oppositions and uniting. But we don't know. Right.
Well, I will grant you there is a level of hermeticism that comes through Shakespearean plays. He was clearly influenced by the Hermetic culture. And I guess at that point, one might wish to compare the Western esoteric tradition, the Hermetic tradition, with Eastern mysticism. I suppose scholars will debate this for a long time, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I'm of the opinion that the Eastern mystics were much more concerned with the ultimate source of things than the Hermeticists were.
If I open my mouth, it'll be a big mistake. Soap bubbles will come out. I think you just said a mouthful, Jeffrey. I'll just say one thing. Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, comparing psychology, once quipped, Western psychology is nice, but it's like kindergarten compared to Eastern psychology. That said, I don't know that it's how much we actually know about the Hermetic traditions of, the pre-Renaissance, the Renaissance, and how much of it was necessarily bound up in imagery and the church in order to preserve its own tradition in a situation where they were more imperiled and at risk, a endangered species, if you will, in the culture, than in the East, where spirituality has just never really gone underground unless there was like a Confucian backlash for a period of time or something equivalent, or as it happened under Hafiz. But I'm merely putting a personal footnote upon your wise observation.
Well, I guess what we're getting at is the nature of language itself, to communicate reality. Reality is a very elusive thing, and it's very undoubtedly very presumptuous of me when I refer to different intellectual traditions to know or to presume to know what was really going on behind the language.
I took the point of view of Lao Tzu, who says those who speak don't know, those who don't know speak. But deeper, I think we're back to poetry, that Lao Tzu used poetry in order to convey what ordinarily gets filtered out by the nature of any language system, Eastern or Western. And same, Dhammapada is poetry. Jesus, in Aramaic, it's poetry. Portions of the Old Testament, certainly poetry. And there, I'm hearing language at a different level. It's like in Zen, there's a common saying, first there's a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. And if you start off by thinking these are mountains and these are rivers, well, you may be in a dream. You may not really be seeing what's in front of your face. And when you see what's in front of your face, you see, oh, this mountain isn't really a mountain. It's several mountains within it, and it's got rocks, and it's got trees, and it's got living things. And where does the mountain end and the sky begin? And then you can say, it's a mountain. And I think that's what the poets do. They come to the point after the trial or the furnace or whatever the alchemical equivalent would be of transforming and healing the wounds of language and using language in a way that's healing and transformative, which is probably completely off from your original question, I know.
No, not at all, Gary. And in fact, it's getting right to the point I would like to address, which is that Hafiz and Rumi and Omar Khayyam all wrote about the tavern and intoxication. And they did so in the midst of a Muslim culture in which alcohol was forbidden.
Right. So we're back to your initial question of antinomianism in a different way. So you make the statement, is there a question or is it just a prompt for me? Is it a...
It's a prompt.
So let me take a step back and then a further step back. The first step back is, yes, wine is technically illegal in a Muslim country. And so we have the Rendi, the antinomians who go, no, it's used in court. In courtly gatherings, they would have wine parties, wine pop-ups. And at the outskirts of town, there would be Zoroastrians or Jews who maintained a little tavern. But this is all kind of, it still is covert if it's not within the court. And so the empire is far away. And so the further you are, the more you can maybe, get away with this. And then you have and Hafez certainly partook of both. He was at courtly wine pop-ups and at these taverns where the dregs drinkers would open and close the place, 24/7. And in my hearing of it, it's a point of initiation. It's the point at which we come from our suffering, our inability to connect completely with life as it is and who we are, and find some way for ourselves. It might be escaping it initially, anywhere but out of this world, as Baudelaire says. But we find it's an initiation into waking up, a different way of viewing. And so we have both. We have Hafiz is talking about real grapes. Khayyam is talking about real grapes, certainly. And the goblet is the human body that the soul is filling with the spirit, the Holy Spirit of the wine. And we get into a whole symbolism of the tavern keeper. Who is he? And the tavern keeper has these like geishas that are serving the wine. They're male geishas called saki, who are groomed to be people you're going to fall in love with at the tavern. It's going to open your heart. So the language of words finds a different form of expression in these poets when they talk about wine, because it's both a literal and a symbolic merger, where it's up to us to hear for ourselves.
Talk about a synchronicity.
Hear for ourselves, right? I promised I'd take a step back, and the step back is the way that I put it together for readers today. Well, actually, it reminds me of something else, so I'll go for it. The first thing is that the book is arranged in 5 gardens. Hafiz does no arrangement, and even within the poems themselves, there's no arrangement often. And we've taken fragments and then worked with those. Okay. And the first is the world, where we encounter things we talked about earlier of the state of the world, the soul of the world, and reasons for despair and so forth. And then the next is going to the tavern, going to wine, as like who wouldn't in such a circumstance, but then getting an initiation. So it's kind of like it's a kind of a Sufi journey. And from wine, we go to love, where the beloved, secular or non-secular, is that which is deepest within us, that we're finally connecting with, or finding our separation and seeing how difficult that separation is, and finding how to go past the separation. And language is a point of separation. And then it goes into wisdom, which is a very intense part of the book, and then ecstasy. To use this analogy just one more way before we're back, you might say that this book makes Hafiz new by pouring his ancient wine into new bottles. But I think it's more than that, because I think it's more than wine. I think it's making him now in our present moment. So his ancient bones can dance, and we with them.
One of the things that you've done in this book, as I understand it, is rather than include the lengthy poems, you've broken them down into very short segments.
That's exactly right. And for whatever reason, mainly that he's untranslatable. We discovered, or rather my partner in Iran, Erfan Mojib, showed me these workings by the preeminent Iranian filmmaker Abbas Kiarostami, of the leader of the Iranian New Wave cinema, who made 4 books of Persian poets using a technique of his own, where as a filmmaker he would either look at them in close-up or as big shot, depending on your point of view. Is it a close-up? Is it a big shot? And then he would edit them into lines so that a line or two would become a poem. Apparently there are others I'm discovering who have felt that in presenting Hafiz in English, this kind of vignette approach might be appropriate. And then putting them together, that was the next collaboration, and making possibly a unit of its own.
Could I ask you to read some of the translations that you've created?
Oh, well, I'm honored that we can not just talk about. It starts off in the Garden of the World with a very brief fragment. Between these 2 doors, this caravan. And then it goes on, and I won't read those. Love, this is from now the Garden of Wine. Love is a huge pearl. I am a deep sea diver. The ocean is the tavern on the outskirts of town. These are also nice. I could read them twice, but I'll see if I can get through some of these. I'll read like 4 or 5. These 2 follow each other in the book. No, I'll read 3 out of 4 from this page. If you're our classmate in the school of love, drown your notebook. True knowledge isn't there. Where is the mystic who understands the language of lilies? Why do they leave only to return again? I asked the old magus, when did the all-wise make you a seer? Same day, he said, as the great azure dome was made. I would gladly trade the Garden of Paradise with the shade of its heavenly trees and the celestial castles with all of their nymphs in exchange for the dust in the alley of the friend. Don't take this moment. Don't take this moment of friendship for granted. In the front door, out the back, then to meet again no more. Here are 2 short ones. One's at the bottom of a page, at the top. The night of separation is gone. The welcome scent of unity has arrived. What a wonderful morning after such a wonderful night. In this garden, white-haired Hafiz prays to God. Let me sit again beside a stream with a lovely tall cypress by my side. No surprise if in Seventh Heaven, lyrics composed by Hafiz and sung by Venus entice Jesus to dance.
Those are wonderful, Gary. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your vision and your knowledge of this awesome tradition. It's been a joy to be with you. Thank you so much for being with me, Gary.
Jeffrey, it's an unspeakable pleasure, a privilege, and divine delight. Thank you so much.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us. You are the reason that we are here. I imagine that by now, many of you already realize that in conjunction with White Crow Books, we've just launched the new Thinking Aloud Dialogues book imprint, and our first title is There Life After Death? New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.